Before modern courts, lawyers, or even kings as we know them, there was a man who etched justice into stone. His name was Hammurabi, and his laws shaped the way we govern to this very day. Stay with me, because I'll tell you what happened. The year was 1792 BC, and the world was a vastly different place than the one we know today. There were no constitutions, no supreme courts, no elaborate legal systems, with centuries of precedent to guide them. Justice was often arbitrary, dispensed by whoever held the most power in any given moment. Kings ruled by divine right, but their interpretation of divine will could change as quickly as the desert winds that swept across the ancient Near East. In this world of uncertainty, where a merchant could lose his livelihood over a disputed contract with no recourse, where a farmer might see his land seized without explanation, where families could be torn apart by the whims of local officials, one man dared to imagine something different. This man understood that true power didn't come from the sword alone, but from something far more enduring: the written word. He recognized that a kingdom built on fear and arbitrary rule would crumble like sand, but one built on consistent, knowable laws could stand for millennia. His vision would not only transform his own empire, but would echo through history, influencing legal systems that wouldn't emerge for thousands of years. The principles he established would find their way into Roman law, medieval codes, and eventually into the very foundations of modern democracy. But this story begins not with grand proclamations or divine revelations, but in the bustling streets of an ancient city where the seeds of civilization were taking root along the banks of two great rivers, at the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved their ancient paths through the Fertile Crescent, rose a city that would become synonymous with power, culture, and human ambition. Babylon was not merely a settlement, it was a statement. By 1792 BC, what had begun as a modest regional town had transformed into something unprecedented in human history, a cosmopolitan center that drew people, goods, and ideas from across the known world. The city's red brick walls, baked hard under the relentless Mesopotamian sun, rose like monuments to human ingenuity. These weren't simple defensive barriers but architectural marvels that spoke to the sophistication of their builders. The walls shimmered in the desert heat, their surfaces reflecting the light in ways that made the entire city appear to glow from a distance. Travelers approaching Babylon from any direction would see this luminous beacon long before they could make out individual buildings, and they knew they were approaching something extraordinary. Within these walls, the city pulsed with life in ways that few settlements of the ancient world could match. The famous ziggurats, those stepped temple towers that reached toward the heavens, dominated the skyline, their massive forms serving both as religious centers and as symbols of the city's reach toward the divine. The largest of these, dedicated to Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, rose in terraced levels that seemed to climb toward the very realm of the gods themselves. From its summit, priests could survey the entire city and the surrounding countryside, reinforcing the connection between earthly power and divine authority. But it was in the markets and streets where Babylon's true character revealed itself. The city had become a crossroads of the ancient world, where merchants from Sumer brought their cuneiform tablets filled with mathematical innovations, where Akkadian traders arrived with goods from distant lands, and where representatives from smaller city-states came to negotiate treaties and trade agreements. The air was filled with a dozen different languages, the scent of exotic spices, and the constant hum of commerce that never seemed to cease. The diversity of Babylon's population was both its greatest strength and its greatest challenge. Sumerians, with their ancient traditions and sophisticated understanding of agriculture and astronomy, lived alongside Akkadians who had brought their own language and customs. Amorites, Elamites, and peoples from dozens of smaller tribes and city-states had made Babylon their home, each group bringing their own laws, their own gods, and their own ways of resolving disputes. This cultural melting pot created unprecedented opportunities for innovation and growth, but it also created problems that no previous ruler had ever had to solve. How do you govern a population that speaks different languages, worships different gods, and follows different customs? How do you ensure that a Sumerian merchant receives fair treatment in a dispute with an Akkadian customer? How do you prevent the stronger groups from simply overwhelming the weaker ones? How do you create unity without destroying the diversity that made the city so vibrant and prosperous? Previous rulers had attempted to solve these problems through force, imposing their will through military might and hoping that fear would keep the peace. But this approach had significant limitations. Fear-based rule required constant vigilance and frequent displays of power. It bred resentment and rebellion. Most importantly, it was inefficient. A ruler couldn't be everywhere at once, and local officials often interpreted royal will in ways that served their own interests rather than those of the kingdom as a whole. Into this complex world stepped a young king who would approach these challenges with a fundamentally different philosophy. Hammurabi understood that lasting power required more than military strength. It required legitimacy, and legitimacy, he believed, could only come from justice, not the arbitrary justice of royal whim, but a systematic, predictable form of justice that all people could understand and rely upon. Hammurabi wasn't born into the kind of glory that some ancient kings inherited. He didn't ascend to the throne of a vast empire or inherit the loyalty of conquered peoples. Instead, he came to power in a Babylon that was significant but not yet dominant, influential but not yet imperial. What he possessed was something perhaps more valuable than inherited power: vision, intelligence, and an understanding that the old ways of ruling were inadequate for the new world that was emerging. When Hammurabi assumed the throne of Babylon around 1792 BC, he inherited a kingdom that was prosperous but precarious. The city-state was wealthy from trade and blessed with fertile agricultural lands, but it existed in a world where larger empires constantly threatened to absorb smaller neighbors: the Elamites to the east, the Assyrians to the north, and various Amorite kingdoms to the west. All possessed the military strength to potentially overwhelm Babylon if they chose to do so. A conventional ruler might have focused immediately on military expansion, seeking to conquer neighboring territories before they could threaten his own. But Hammurabi demonstrated from the beginning of his reign that he was anything but conventional. While he certainly understood the importance of military strength and would prove himself a capable military commander when necessary, his primary focus was on something far more innovative: the creation of a systematic approach to governance that could unite his diverse population and provide a foundation for sustainable growth. Hammurabi's early years as king were marked by careful diplomacy and strategic alliance building. Rather than immediately launching military campaigns, he spent considerable time and effort establishing relationships with neighboring rulers, negotiating trade agreements, and positioning Babylon as an indispensable partner rather than a threatening rival. This approach required patience and sophistication, qualities that would serve him well in his later, more famous endeavors. But even as he engaged in these external diplomatic efforts, Hammurabi was observing and learning from the internal dynamics of his kingdom. He spent time in the markets, listening to disputes between merchants. He visited agricultural areas, observing how conflicts over water rights and land boundaries were resolved. He met with priests and local officials, understanding how different communities within his kingdom handled questions of justice and social order. What he discovered was a patchwork system of local customs, tribal traditions, and ad hoc decisions that varied dramatically from one part of his kingdom to another. A merchant who understood the customs of one district might find himself completely lost in another. A farmer who knew his rights under Sumerian tradition might discover that those rights meant nothing in an area dominated by Akkadian customs. Most troubling of all, local officials often made decisions based on personal relationships, bribes, or their own interpretation of what they thought the king might want, rather than on any consistent principles of justice. This inconsistency wasn't just unfair, it was economically destructive. Trade suffered when merchants couldn't predict how disputes would be resolved. Agricultural productivity declined when farmers weren't certain of their rights to land and water. Social tensions increased when people felt that justice depended more on who you knew than on the merits of your case. Hammurabi began to envision a different approach. What if, instead of leaving justice to the whims of local officials and the vagaries of local custom, there were universal principles that applied throughout his kingdom? What if these principles were not secret knowledge held by priests and nobles, but were publicly available for all to see and understand? What if the law itself, rather than the personal authority of the king, became the foundation of social order? This vision was revolutionary in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. In Hammurabi's time, law was generally understood to be the personal will of the ruler, interpreted and applied by his representatives. The idea that law could exist independently of the ruler, that it could constrain even royal power, was almost unthinkable. Kings ruled by divine right, and their word was literally law. To suggest that even kings should be bound by written principles was to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of political authority. But Hammurabi was not deterred by the radical nature of his vision. He began to assemble a team of scholars, priests, and scribes to undertake an unprecedented project. His systematic collection and codification of legal principles that could serve as the foundation for universal justice throughout his kingdom. This wasn't simply a matter of writing down existing laws. Many of the customs and traditions he was working with had never been written down at all, existing only in oral form, and varying from community to community. The process required years of careful research and consultation. Hammurabi's scholars traveled throughout the kingdom, documenting local customs and traditions. They consulted with elders who remembered how disputes had been resolved in the past. They studied the few written legal documents that existed, analyzing the principles underlying specific decisions. They examined the legal traditions of neighboring kingdoms, looking for ideas that might be adapted to Babylonian circumstances. But this was more than an academic exercise. Hammurabi understood that for his legal code to be effective, it had to be more than just a collection of abstract principles. It had to address the real problems that his people faced in their daily lives. It had to be practical, understandable, and enforceable. Most importantly, it had to command respect and legitimacy from a population that was accustomed to very different approaches to justice. As his legal scholars worked on codification, Hammurabi himself was engaged in the military and diplomatic campaigns that would expand his kingdom and provide him with the power necessary to implement his legal reforms. Through a combination of strategic alliances, careful timing, and military skill, he gradually extended Babylonian control over much of Mesopotamia. But unlike many conquerors, Hammurabi's goal was not simply to extract tribute from conquered territories. Instead, he sought to integrate these new regions into a unified kingdom governed by consistent legal principles. After years of preparation, research, and political consolidation, Hammurabi was ready to unveil his masterpiece. The result was not merely a collection of laws, but a monument to human civilization itself. A massive basalt stele standing over 7 feet tall and weighing several tons, carved with 282 individual laws written in the elegant cuneiform script of the Akkadian language. The stele itself was a work of art as much as a legal document. At its top, carved in relief, was a scene showing Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from the Mesopotamian god of justice. This wasn't merely decorative. It was a powerful statement about the source and authority of the laws that followed. By depicting himself as receiving divine instruction, Hammurabi was establishing that these laws were not arbitrary royal decrees, but sacred principles that even he, as king, was bound to uphold. The choice of basalt for the stele was equally significant. This volcanic rock was incredibly durable, resistant to weathering and virtually impossible to destroy without deliberate effort. The message was clear. These laws were meant to endure. Unlike royal proclamations written on clay tablets that could easily be broken or papyrus documents that would decay over time, this legal code was literally carved in stone, intended to outlast dynasties and empires. The laws themselves covered virtually every aspect of daily life in ancient Babylon. They addressed family relationships, establishing rules for marriage, divorce, inheritance, and the treatment of children. They regulated business transactions, setting standards for contracts, loans, and commercial disputes. They governed agricultural practices, defining rights to land and water and establishing penalties for damage to crops or livestock. They addressed issues of slavery, property rights, and personal injury in ways that attempted to balance the interests of different social classes while maintaining social order. One of the most famous principles embedded in Hammurabi's code was the concept of proportional justice, often summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This principle, known as lex talionis, might seem harsh by modern standards, but it represented a significant advance in legal thinking. Rather than allowing unlimited revenge or arbitrary punishment, it established the principle that punishment should be proportional to the crime. If someone caused injury, they could be punished, but the punishment could not exceed the harm they had caused. This principle of proportionality extended throughout the code in sophisticated ways. The laws recognized that Babylonian society was with different classes of people, free citizens, commoners, and slaves, having different rights and responsibilities. While this might seem unjust by modern egalitarian standards, it represented a systematic attempt to create predictable legal outcomes based on clearly defined social categories rather than the arbitrary whims of judges or the personal relationships of the parties involved. The code also established important procedural principles that would influence legal systems for millennia to come. It required that accusations be proven rather than simply asserted. It established the presumption of innocence, requiring accusers to provide evidence for their claims. It created a system of witnesses and testimony that attempted to ensure legal decisions were based on facts, rather than speculation or prejudice. Perhaps most importantly, the code established the principle that law should be public and accessible. The massive stele was erected in the center of Babylon, in a location where any citizen could see it and, if they were literate, read it for themselves. For those who could not read, scribes were available to explain the relevant laws. This public accessibility was revolutionary for the first time in human history. Ordinary people could know in advance what the law required of them and what protections it offered them. The laws themselves reveal fascinating details about daily life in ancient Babylon. There were regulations governing the responsibilities of tavern keepers, the proper treatment of animals, the obligations of tenants to landlords, and the rights of women in various circumstances. Some laws dealt with what we would now consider criminal assault, murder, while others addressed civil disputes over contracts, property, and family relationships. The code also established an early form of consumer protection, regulating the quality of goods sold in markets and establishing penalties for merchants who cheated their customers. It addressed professional malpractice, holding doctors, builders, and other skilled workers accountable for the quality of their work. It even included what might be considered early environmental regulations, establishing penalties for actions that could damage irrigation systems or contaminate water supplies. One of the most sophisticated aspects of the code was its recognition that different types of harm required different types of remedies. Some violations could be addressed through financial compensation, others required physical punishment, and the most serious crimes were punishable by death. But even in cases involving severe penalties, the code attempted to ensure that punishment was swift and certain rather than arbitrary and unpredictable. The code also addressed issues that remain relevant in legal systems today. It established rules for evidence and testimony, created procedures for appeals, and attempted to prevent corruption among officials. It recognized the importance of contracts and established principles for their enforcement. It addressed questions of liability and responsibility in ways that attempted to balance individual accountability with social stability. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Hammurabi's code was not any specific law, but the underlying principle that law itself could serve as the foundation of social order. By creating a comprehensive, written legal system and making it publicly accessible, Hammurabi was establishing the idea that justice could be systematic rather than arbitrary, predictable rather than capricious, and universal rather than dependent on personal relationships or social status. The immediate impact of Hammurabi's legal code was transformative for Babylon and the surrounding regions. For the first time, merchants could engage in trade with confidence, knowing that disputes would be resolved according to predictable principles rather than the arbitrary decisions of local officials. Farmers could invest in improving their land, secure in the knowledge that their rights would be protected by written law. Families could plan for the future, understanding how inheritance and property rights would be handled. But the true significance of Hammurabi's achievement would only become apparent over the centuries and millennia that followed. The code represented a fundamental shift in human thinking about the nature of justice, governance, and social order. It established principles and precedents that would influence every subsequent legal system in the Western world, and many beyond. When Babylon eventually fell to other powers, the physical stele was carried off as a trophy of war, eventually ending up in the ancient Persian city of Susa. But the ideas embedded in the code could not be conquered or destroyed. Copies of the laws had been made and distributed throughout the former Babylonian Empire, and the principles they embodied continued to influence legal thinking long after the original kingdom had disappeared. The influence of Hammurabi's code can be traced through the legal systems of subsequent Mesopotamian empires. The Assyrians, who conquered much of the former Babylonian territory, incorporated many of Hammurabi's principles into their own legal codes. The Persians, who built one of the largest empires in ancient history, drew upon Babylonian legal traditions as they developed systems for governing their diverse populations. Even the Hebrews, whose legal traditions are recorded in the Hebrew Bible, show clear influences from Mesopotamian legal thinking, including the principle of proportional justice that appears in the famous passage about an eye for an eye. When Greek civilization began to develop its own legal and political institutions, Greek scholars studied the legal traditions of the Near East, including the Babylonian codes. The concept of written law as a foundation for social order, which Hammurabi had pioneered, became central to Greek political thought. The idea that even rulers should be bound by law, rather than being above it, influenced the development of Greek democracy and the concept of the rule of law. The Romans, who built upon Greek legal and political traditions while developing their own sophisticated legal system, were also influenced by the precedents established in Mesopotamia. Roman law, which would become the foundation for legal systems throughout Europe and eventually much of the world, incorporated many principles that can be traced back to Hammurabi's code. The Roman concept of written law, the importance of legal procedures, the principle of proportional punishment, and the idea that law should be public and accessible all echo themes that Hammurabi had established more than a millennium earlier. During the medieval period, when European scholars rediscovered many ancient texts, Hammurabi's code was studied alongside Roman law and biblical legal traditions. Medieval legal scholars recognized the sophistication of the Babylonian legal system and incorporated many of its principles into the legal codes that were being developed for emerging European kingdoms. The influence of Hammurabi's legal thinking can even be traced into the modern era, when the American founders were developing the Constitution and the legal system of the new United States. They drew upon centuries of legal tradition that ultimately traced back to ancient Mesopotamia. The principle that government should be based on written law rather than the arbitrary will of rulers, the concept of due process, the importance of evidence and testimony in legal proceedings, and the idea that law should be public and accessible all reflect principles that Hammurabi had established thousands of years earlier. This influence is literally carved in stone in the United States Supreme Court building, where a frieze above the main entrance depicts Hammurabi alongside other great lawgivers of history. The inclusion of this ancient Mesopotamian king among the figures honored in America's highest court represents recognition of his fundamental contribution to the development of legal civilization. But Hammurabi's influence extends beyond the Western legal tradition. Legal systems throughout the world have grappled with the same fundamental questions that he addressed. How can law serve as a foundation for social order? How can justice be made predictable and fair? How can legal systems balance the needs of different groups within society? How can law adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining stability and continuity? Modern international law, which attempts to create legal frameworks for relationships between nations, faces challenges remarkably similar to those that Hammurabi confronted when trying to create legal unity among the diverse populations of his empire. The principles he established that law should be written, public, and consistently applied remain central to contemporary efforts to create international legal institutions. The code's emphasis on evidence and procedure has influenced the development of modern criminal justice systems around the world. The principle that accusations must be proven rather than simply asserted, that defendants should have opportunities to present their side of the story, and that punishment should be proportional to the crime, all reflect legal thinking that can be traced back to ancient Babylon. Even in areas where modern legal systems have moved far beyond the specific provisions of Hammurabi's code, the underlying principles he established continue to be relevant. The idea that law should serve to protect the weak from the strong, that legal systems should be designed to promote social stability and economic prosperity, and that justice should be based on consistent principles rather than arbitrary power, all remain central to contemporary legal thinking. As we stand in our modern world, surrounded by the complex legal institutions that govern our daily lives, it's easy to forget that these systems had to be invented by someone. The courts, where we seek justice, the contracts that govern our business relationships, the constitutional principles that limit government power, and the international laws that attempt to regulate relationships between nations all trace their origins back to fundamental innovations in human thinking about law and justice. Hammurabi's great achievement was not simply the creation of a specific set of laws, but the establishment of the principle that law itself could serve as the foundation of civilization. Before his time, justice was largely a matter of personal power, tribal custom, or royal whim. After his code was carved in stone and erected in the center of Babylon, The world had a new model for how human societies could organize themselves around consistent, predictable, and publicly accessible principles of justice. The specific laws that Hammurabi established may seem harsh or unfair by modern standards, and many of the social assumptions embedded in his code, particularly regarding slavery and the treatment of women, are completely unacceptable today. But the underlying principles he established, that law should be written, public, and consistently applied, that justice should be based on evidence rather than arbitrary power, that even rulers should be bound by legal principles, these ideas remain as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago. When we sign a contract, we rely on legal principles that ensure it will be enforced according to predictable rules rather than the whims of whoever happens to be in power. When we go to court, we expect that our case will be decided based on evidence and established legal procedures rather than personal relationships or bribes. When we criticize government actions, we assume that even the most powerful officials are bound by constitutional principles and legal constraints. All of these expectations, which seem so natural to us that we rarely think about them, represent the inheritance of legal thinking that began with Hammurabi's revolutionary decision to carve justice into stone, his vision of law as the foundation of social order, his commitment to making legal principles public and accessible, and his understanding that consistent justice was essential for a prosperous and stable society established precedents that continue to shape our world today. The next time you encounter any aspect of our legal system, whether you're signing a contract, serving on a jury, or simply reading about a court case in the news, remember the ancient king who first dared to imagine that human societies could be governed by written principles of justice, rather than the arbitrary will of whoever happened to hold power. Remember Hammurabi, the shepherd king who brought order to chaos, and whose laws, carved in stone over for millennia ago, continue to echo through the halls of justice today. In a world that often seems chaotic and unpredictable, where powerful interests sometimes seem to operate above the law, and where justice can appear elusive, Hammurabi's example reminds us that the rule of law is not a natural phenomena, but a human achievement. It had to be imagined, created, and constantly defended by people who believed that civilization required more than just the exercise of power, it required the establishment of justice. His legacy challenges us to continue that work, to strengthen and improve the legal institutions we have inherited, and to ensure that the principles of justice he first carved in stone continue to serve as the foundation for human civilization. So the next time you sign a contract, go to court, or even pay a fine, remember the man who first wrote down the rules. Remember Hammurabi, the king who brought order to chaos, whose vision of justice carved in stone became the foundation upon which all subsequent legal civilization would be built. His story reminds us that the legal protections we take for granted today are not inevitable features of human society, but precious achievements that must be understood, appreciated, and continually renewed by each generation that inherits them. So next time you sign a contract, go to court, or even pay a fine, remember the man who first wrote down the rules. Hammurabi, the king who brought order to chaos. If you liked this story, leave a like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more hidden tales of history, because I'll tell you what happened is just getting started.